I would request that we all take our seats. We will start in 2 minutes. Distinguidos delegados y delegadas, antes de abrir la segunda sesión plenaria, invito a los miembros a ver un video conmemorativo en honor del fallecido secretario general Kofi Annan.
I remain convinced that the only answer to this divided world must be a truly united nations. Climate change, HIV/AIDS, fair trade, migration, human rights, all these issues and many more bring us back to that point. Addressing each is indispensable for each of us in our village, in our neighborhood, and in our country. Each of us must share the pain of all who suffer and the joy of all who hope. That is what the founders of this organization believed in. It is what I believe in. It is what the vast majority of people in this world want to believe in. Together, we have pushed some big rocks to the top of the mountain, even if others have slipped from our grasp and rolled back. But this mountain, with its brazen winds and global views, is the best place on earth to be. It's been difficult and challenging, but at times thrillingly rewarding. I yield my place to others with an obstinate feeling, a real obstinate feeling of hope for our common future.
Invito ahora a los miembros a escuchar una composición musical con acompañamiento de tambor, una oda en honor del fallecido secretario general Kofi Annan, interpretada por el señor Kwame Ansabru de Ghana, profesor de estudios africanos en la Universidad de Maryland.
Odumankuma baadie obo eshen ena obo ochirema esro twa kwan okwan tresro opani ni hwan yebo kwan no koto esro no esro no fritete odumankuma momra bribri odumankuma chirema refrefrem odumankuma chirema kwame ansatseseku refrefrem me refrefrem se de nyankonton frefre nsuo no akuni ne adehia mohyiemu a monya sopa entie me de asemunam okunini ahwiase odupon kese bi atutu ama ato abesene ama wiase nyina abonyenye Ghana bakoma oti akrewri ni akrewri ne brewri na nasa tutu abebi odisi kronkron ne asanteman busumru abibiman sroma wiase dikamfo awrefremu odumankuma atwenoko nekura Bosomor Kofi yama demrifa die ni amani hunu okatachie kukudrufo Bosomor Kofi ata Annan asumdwe krafo wode abotare nimdie ne pepepe ye wakoban Bosomor Kofi wutu hoche wiase amanto nyina wode wonkwa pere hwehwe asumdwe wo baabiara wodin ene wanu onyam enyirada amanaman bekao dada akoko fufu a akroma hye wonso kasa amano Kofi aman nkabom hwesofo Sribo sechia yesi wodade kodi eninsem Kofi asomdwewura yamodie ni amanihunu Kofi a opimpa magoi enkrofo retete no na wore pimpam animu anini opening twerebo nana ne ho bon atuduro bosomuru Kofi a onye pesami nkuminya amansan beka wodada yama bosomuru Kofi yama nantiye okwanso kusekuse okwanso brebre washe abibiman animonyam yama demri fedue ni amanihu enti yekan a yemoase odumankuma bowo mowo fa no ampa abibiman abibrem abakuma wafrimu ama esum adruyen asundwiemu nakoda nada prekunkom busumuru Kofi ata Annan yama demri fedue due ni amanihunu due
Declaro abierta la segunda sesión plenaria de la Asamblea General. Tenemos el triste deber de rendir homenaje a la memoria del excelentísimo señor Kofi Annan, séptimo secretario general de las Naciones Unidas, que falleciera el 18 de agosto de 2018. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, Mr. Secretary General, ladies and gentlemen, it is with great sadness that we begin this 73rd session of our Assembly by acknowledging a great loss, that of Kofi Annan, who will surely be remembered as one of the outstanding leaders of this organization. But it is also eminently fitting that we remember him on this day, a day fixed by the Assembly 70 years ago, on his watch and with his strong support as International Peace Day. For no one labored more tirelessly or consistently in the cause of peace than did Kofi Annan. Kofi Annan was a great Secretary General because he understood that peace cannot be achieved in isolation. He subscribed fully to the principles set out in the preamble to our charter and knew that they are mutually interdependent. Succeeding generations will not be saved from the scourge of war unless and until human beings can have faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women, and of nations, large and small. Unless and until conditions are established under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained. Unless and until we succeed in promoting social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. In larger freedom was indeed the title of Kofi Annan's report to this Assembly in 2005, in which he asserted that peace and security, development and human rights are the three indispensable and mutually reinforcing pillars of the organization. And 5 years earlier, he had submitted his Millennium Report, using as its title the very first words of the Charter, "We the peoples." It fell to him to guide us from the 20th century into the 21st, and he knew well that in the 21st century, the United Nations would have to convince the peoples of the world, not just the governments, that it was doing something useful to them, something that offered them hope of a better and more rewarding life. His genius lay in his ability to enlist the member states in a common effort to achieve that end. Perhaps no other Secretary General could have persuaded this Assembly not only to mark the year 2000 by convening at a summit level, but also to commission a report from him which articulated the aspirations of humanity as it embarked on the new millennium, and which formed the basis for the Millennium Declaration, including the Millennium Development Goals. Rightly, he cited this as his greatest achievement. It was thanks in large part to his influence that those goals included the pledges to ensure that by 2015, girls and boys will have equal access to all levels of education, and by the same date to have halted and begun to reverse the spread of HIV/AIDS, the scourge of malaria, and other major diseases. These were causes very dear to his heart and to which he continued to devote himself after leaving office, notably through the work of his foundation, which I hope will continue. He reminded member states regularly that empowering women meant empowering whole nations, that there is no tool for development more effective than women's advancement, that no other policy is as likely to raise economic productivity and promote health or increase the chances of education for next generations. And he often urged the entire international community to remember that promoting gender equality is not only women's responsibility, it is the responsibility of all of us. He retained throughout his life a strong concern not only for the welfare of refugees and migrants, but also for the greater recognition of the important contribution they could make. He showed great foresight in persuading the late Peter Sutherland to become the first special representative for migration. He owed it to him and to his legacy to do everything we can to finalize and implement the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration and the Global Compact on Refugees. Kofi Annan could be heard around the world without raising his voice, but he could also achieve results in private through quiet diplomacy. Probably few of us here today, except the delegates of Nigeria and Cameroon, have ever heard of the Bokassi Peninsula, but he might have learned all too much about it had not Kofi Annan devoted years of discreet diplomacy to working with the presidents of those two countries to prevent it becoming a cause of war. And we would search the Charter in vain for any article mandating the Secretary General to bring together private corporations to discuss ways of improving global public health. Yet there must be many thousands of people alive today who would not be if Kofi Annan had not brought together the heads of the world's major pharmaceutical companies and persuaded them to make antiretroviral drugs available in poor countries at affordable prices. That was his style. It is true that he disliked confrontation, but this was deliberately and carefully considered choice. He was very clear in speaking up for the principles and purposes of this organization, but he knew that shouting at people or denouncing individual states or leaders by name would achieve little, very little, except to diminish his ability to influence them. But he never forgot that a lesser evil is still an evil, or that the use of force without right authority is a danger to us all. In this moment, when we all feel his loss, let me express my special sympathy to his wife, Nan, who was a tower of strength for him throughout his time in office, and since to their children, Kojo, Ama, and Nina, who are also with us today. The UN staff to the UN staff who work with him here and around the world, all of whom must feel a little orphaned today. And finally, to the people of Ghana, who were so proud of him and laid him to rest so magnificently last week. The late Kofi Annan loved the Akan proverbs of Ghana. One such proverb goes, and I cite, "We go to a funeral to mourn the living." As we mourn the loss of Mr. Annan, we are reminded of how much work is left to be done to build the legacy of the former Secretary General. To live up to his example is a formidable challenge to us all, but most of all, perhaps, to the current holder of this office. It is therefore with great sympathy as well as respect that I now give the floor to the current Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres. I thank you. Invito entonces ahora al Secretario General de las Naciones Unidas, al excelentísimo señor Antonio Guterres, a formular su declaración.
Excellencies, colleagues, and friends, Mrs. Nane Annan and members of the Annan family, we are deeply honored and graced by your presence. The United Nations and Kofi Annan were inseparable. It is impossible to say where one ended and the other began. And so, dear Annan family, we say to you today, not only welcome, but welcome home. To so many of us, Kofi Annan was more than just a dear friend. He was family. And I know you all feel in this room the profound sorrow that accompanies the sudden passing of such a beloved leader, mentor, and guide. Kofi Annan was uncommonly warm, accessible, and of the people. But above all, he was principled and forceful in battling for the values of the UN Charter. In recent weeks, so many of his former colleagues have fondly recalled a workplace encounter or an unexpected phone call asking after their well-being or that of their family. He had a knack for assembling solid teams and winning their allegiance by giving them room to do their best. He was charming and wise, kind and courageous. But he also knew how to deliver the barb in his masterly, subtle way. I wonder if that is the best approach he would muse. Or perhaps he might say, I would want to be sure. And sometimes people were so captivated by his presence that they did not realize that they were being admonished. I have an enormous depth of gratitude towards Kofi Annan. And not only because I would very probably not be here if he had not chosen me to become, 13 years ago, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. That was probably his worst mistake. At our service in Accra last week, Kofi Annan was described as a good and faithful servant, as was indeed good at everything he did across a life of true service. And he would be the first to describe any achievements as the product of teamwork. But let me mention just two of the so many examples where his individual brilliance shone through. His personal advocacy to mobilize a global response to the HIV/AIDS epidemic led to actions that saved millions of lives. And his efforts to articulate the Millennium Development Goals rallied the world behind poverty eradication and paved the way for the 2030 Agenda, today's ambitious blueprint for a better world. In a world of impunity and buck-passing, his willingness to own up to setbacks was also refreshing and a remarkable example. And his moral voice led the world towards groundbreaking understandings about defending our common humanity. Throughout his tenure, Kofi Annan urged us never to be bystanders in life. He summoned us all to act against bias, brutality, and bloodshed. He was a multilateralist through and through, a true UN blue believer in a rules-based global order. And I must say, his loss cuts even deeper because we have never needed that faith and inspiration more. Kofi Annan called the United Nations the last best hope of humanity. He burned with the flame of human rights, dignity, and justice. We shall miss him every day. But we vow here, in the heart of his beloved home, that we will carry forward this torch now and forevermore. And in the exercise of my duties, he will always be my central inspiration and my deepest reference. Thank you very much.
Quisiera ahora invitar a los Estados miembros a ponerse de pie y observar un minuto de silencio en memoria del excelentísimo Kofi Annan, séptimo secretario general de las Naciones Unidas. Muchas gracias.
Many thanks.
Me gustaría ahora dar la palabra a la distinguida representante de Madagascar, quien hablará en nombre de los estados africanos. Señora embajadora, tiene usted la palabra.
You have the floor.
Madame la Présidente de l'Assemblée générale, Monsieur le Secrétaire général, Madame la Sous-secrétaire générale adjointe, Madame Annan, ainsi que tous les membres de la famille, Mesdames et Messieurs. C'est l'ignorance et non la connaissance qui amène d'autres à affirmer qu'il y a des mondes multiples, alors que nous savons qu'il n'y en a qu'un, le nôtre. J'ai souhaité, à dessein, commencer cette intervention prononcée au nom du groupe africain avec ses propres paroles du regretté Kofi Annan, éloquentes en elles-mêmes quant à sa vision de la nécessité d'une approche collective et non exclusive des relations internationales et qui aura contribué notamment à revoir et recentrer les relations de l'Afrique avec le reste du monde, une Afrique aujourd'hui partie prenante incontournable du système international. Cette vision aura été le moteur qui a mu et guidé ce visionnaire et pionnier de l'Afrique nouvelle, en laquelle il croyait profondément. Convaincu que la prospérité de l'Afrique est essentielle à la stabilité du monde, Kofi Annan a mis toutes ses forces à encourager et à promouvoir les programmes de développement et de lutte contre la pauvreté. Le monde, et particulièrement notre continent, garde le souvenir d'une personnalité de conviction, pétrie de culture et de ténacité, ancrée dans un sens inné du devoir et qui s'est beaucoup investi dans la poursuite de l'équité, la justice et la paix dans le monde et particulièrement sur le continent. Heureux, dit-on, ceux qui ont pu réaliser leurs engagements. Avec le monde entier, je suis convaincue que le regretté Kofi Annan en fait partie, puisque dès le début de son parcours de vie exceptionnel, basé sur les principes d'attention à autrui, du vivre ensemble dans la paix et entre les peuples, il a montré le désir de contribuer à sortir le monde de la pauvreté et en y restaurant la paix et la sécurité. Il y a travaillé inlassablement, notamment en commençant le processus de transformation de notre organisation pour en améliorer le fonctionnement, précurseur en quelque sorte des réformes que nous avons décidées cette année sous la houlette du secrétaire général Antonio Guterres d'enclencher. Ce sont donc l'émotion et un recueillement reconnaissant qui nous rassemblent en ce lieu pour lui rendre un vibrant hommage. Mais nous sommes également présents pour dire notre volonté de nous inspirer de son héritage et continuer le travail qu'il a commencé en rendant les Nations Unies pertinentes pour tous les peuples à travers nos efforts pour la paix et le développement, comme nous le préconise le thème de cette 73e session. Si l'Afrique ne peut pas se consoler de cette pertinence, elle peut en revanche s'enorgueillir des hommages affluents du monde entier pour un de ses fils qui a su gagner le respect universel. La peine qui nous a étreints est consolée par les leçons de vie de cette immense force tranquille partie paisiblement. Que la terre de cette Afrique pour qui il a tant œuvré lui soit légère et qu'il repose en paix. Je vous remercie de votre attention.
Agradezco a la distinguida representante de Madagascar y quisiera dar ahora la palabra al distinguido representante de Sri Lanka, quien hablará en nombre de los estados de Asia y del Pacífico. Tiene la palabra.
Madam President, Mr. Secretary General, Your Excellencies, members of the family of late Kofi Annan, distinguished invitees, ladies and gentlemen. Sri Lanka has the honor to deliver this statement as chair for the month of September on behalf of the Asia-Pacific Group of States and join others to pay tribute to the late Secretary General, His Excellency Mr. Kofi Annan, and celebrate his life and legacy. Kofi Annan was a visionary leader who worked tirelessly to make the world a better and more humane place and remained a strong advocate for norms, values, and principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter. For many, Kofi Annan embodied the values of the United Nations, an organization to which he devoted much of his life, first joining the United Nations family as an administrative officer at the World Health Organization in Geneva in 1962, and rising up through the system to become the first Secretary General elected from the ranks of the United Nations staff. As Secretary General, Mr. Annan led the charge to revitalize the organization and bring it into the new millennium. His first plan for reform, quote, renewing the United Nations, unquote, presented to member states in 1997, continued to be pursued with renewed focus on improving coherence and coordination. During Mr. Annan's tenure in office, he brought new people into the UN to foster a fresh outlook of ideas. He promoted a UN whose mission it was to promote peace and act as a beacon of tolerance and solidarity through dark and turbulent times. His work encouraged the world to rethink what the United Nations had become and push the boundaries as to what it could become in order to respond to contemporary challenges. Mr. Annan's Millennium Report titled, quote, We the Peoples, the Role of the United Nations in the 21st Century, unquote, was a clarion call for us as member states to commit towards an action plan to address crucial issues such as ending inequality and poverty, safeguarding the environment, and protecting people from conflict. His report provided the basis for the Millennium Declaration adopted at the Millennium Summit under his leadership. The summit established a new global partnership among states to pursue common time-bound goals and allowed for the formulation of the MDGs. This served as a bedrock foundation that we continue to build on to form the Sustainable Development Goals agenda. Mr. Annan's call to action to address the HIV/AIDS epidemic led to the establishment of Global AIDS and Health Fund. He was also the founder of the Global Compact Initiative to bring corporate social responsibility to the forefront of business. The joint awarding of the 2001 Nobel Prize for Peace to Mr. Annan and the United Nations Organization was a clear recognition of his immense commitment and contribution to the work of the United Nations. Throughout his life, Kofi Annan stood fearlessly as a voice for peace, human rights, and dignity, and articulated at best a conscience of humanity in often difficult times. Many have paid tribute to his professionalism and for his humanity, warmth, and wit. There are those of us who have been privileged to have worked with him in the UN family or come across him during interactions and discussions. We will remember his towering presence, wisdom, and his soft-spoken style of looking for solutions through diplomacy and dialogue, and recall the dignified and purposeful way he worked towards shaping a better world for all. Our thoughts and wishes are with his wife, Madam Annan, and members of his family, and all those around the world that have been touched by his charisma, tireless work, and compassion. Wednesday this week marked the 12th anniversary of Mr. Annan's farewell statement to the General Assembly.
In his statement, he expressed his gratitude to have served as Secretary General during, quote, a remarkable decade, unquote, and stated, I quote, "Together we have pushed some big rocks to the top of the mountain, even if others have slipped from our grasp and rolled back. But this mountain, with its bracing winds and global views, is the best place on earth to be," unquote. Today, we honor his efforts and his unwavering belief in the United Nations to help forge solutions for many of our common problems. In paying tribute to Mr. Annan, let us remain steadfast in our global efforts to work towards and face challenges together. Mr. Kofi Annan was a peacemaker whose legacy remains. May his memory and the ideals he stood for continue to inspire people around the world, so we may all work together towards a more just, humane, and peaceful world for all. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Sri Lanka, and I would like to give now the floor to the distinguished representative of Georgia. He will speak on behalf of Eastern European states.
Mr. President, Ms. Secretary General, dear colleagues, today we come to pay tribute to His Excellency, Mr. Kofi Annan, the 7th Secretary General of the United Nations. On behalf of the members of the group of Eastern European states, I would like to express our deepest condolences to the family, friends, and colleagues of Mr. Kofi Annan, as well as the government and people of Ghana and the wider United Nations community. We lost a true advocate of diplomacy and an inspiring leader who worked tirelessly for a more peaceful and prosperous world. He served as a statesman who brought people together and believed that there is no bridge too broken to rebuild. Through challenging times, his deep compassion and solidarity encouraged people to strive for peace and development. The profound legacy of Mr. Kofi Annan will remain as a source of inspiration and creativity for exploring possibilities to pursue a better world through joint actions. As a leader of the United Nations, Mr. Annan was dedicated to serve the needs of people and lift the voices of individual men and women. In his own words, and I quote, "Peace must be built from the bottom up and begins with every one of us," unquote. With his vision for global action, Mr. Kofi Annan was devoted to explore wider opportunities across the UN system. He pioneered new groundbreaking initiatives, including Millennium Development Goals, as well as others aimed at promoting human rights and combating life-threatening diseases. His achievement throughout his life led to numerous awards, including the Nobel Peace Prize Award jointly with the United Nations in 2001. Mr. President, His Excellency Mr. Kofi Annan leaves a true mark on history. His lasting legacy will motivate future generations to follow his path to peace and unity. He will be remembered for his wisdom and courage. In this time of grief, our thoughts and sympathy are with his family, colleagues, and the people of Ghana. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Georgia, and I would like now to give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Bahamas. She will speak on behalf of the Latin American and Caribbean states. You have the floor, Madam.
Madam President, Mr. Secretary General Antonio Guterres, Madam Annan and the Annan family, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the group of Latin American and Caribbean states, I would like to express our deep condolences on the passing of Mr. Kofi Annan, former Secretary General of the United Nations. Mr. Annan was the first South Saharan African to hold the position of United Nations Secretary General. He had the distinction of being also the first Secretary General to come from the UN Secretariat. He led the United Nations in a period of transition from the post-Cold War era to the world post-September 11, 2001. Called to action by the challenges of his time as Secretary General, Mr. Annan was a man of values and integrity, a pragmatist who worked tirelessly to uphold the purposes and principles of the Charter. he always underscored the need to revitalize consensus among member states on key challenges and priorities, and to convert that consensus into collective and sustainable action. Mr. Annan was defined as a statesman decades before becoming head of the Secretariat. He knew and understood the multilateral system and strongly defended multilateralism whenever it was called into question. He used his considerable knowledge and vast experience to reform the internal structures and culture of the United Nations with a view to making the organization more beneficial to its staff, partners, member states, and the peoples of the world. The global challenges we faced during his tenure as Secretary General compelled him to become a more proactive leader. In that regard, his milestone report, In Larger Freedom, embraced the idea that development, security, and human rights go hand in hand, a notion that is now at the core of our consensus as an international community. Additionally, Mr. Annan will forever be remembered for his defense of humanitarian intervention and his advocacy of UN peacekeeping. Following his retirement from the UN, his passion and advocacy for peace, human rights, and good governance were further propelled through the Kofi Annan Foundation, a foundation that has contributed to the protection and promotion of peace and development worldwide. The Latin American and Caribbean Group would like to convey to the family of Mr. Annan, his UN family, and to the government and people of Ghana our sincere condolences. His legacy will remain with us forever.
I would like to thank the distinguished representative of the Bahamas, and I would like to now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Monaco. She will speak on behalf of the states of Western Europe and other states. You have the floor, Madam.
Madam President, Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the group of Western European and other states. We learnt with deep emotion and great sorrow of the passing of His Excellency Mr. Kofi Annan, 7th Secretary General of the United Nations, on the 18th of August. To his widow, Nane, and their children, Ama, Kojo, and Nina, we express our deepest condolences. With his passing, the organization in its entirety is in mourning. In many ways, indeed, he personified the UN, which he served for more than 5 decades, first of all at the World Health Organization and at the Office of the High Commissioner for Refugees, then at headquarters as Assistant Secretary General and Under Secretary General, before being elected Secretary General on the 1st of January 1997. Child of Africa and a citizen of the world, he has inspired several generations who place themselves in or identify themselves in the faith he had in multilateralism and the crucial role of our organization. A relentless craftsman of development and peace, it was with him that we stepped into the 21st century. Through the Millennium Summit and the Millennium Development Goals established during his tenure, we reshaped and rethought the way we approached development, public aid and cooperation. And through his reform efforts, Kofi Annan made the UN better equipped for the challenges of this emerging century. We should bring Kofi Annan's spirit with us in our current work, to improve our own work and to continue to reform the United Nations. It was by his side that we mourned the deaths of international civil servants who were killed too soon in the Baghdad bombing. We also mourned the personnel on mission who lost their lives in the service of the organization. Like no other, Kofi Annan embodies the idea that, and I quote, "Without progress there is no peace, and without peace there is no progress." The recognition granted by the Nobel Foundation in 2 equal portions to the Secretary General in 2001, alongside the United Nations as a whole, is an acknowledgement of his exemplary dedication during one of the most unstable periods in modern history. His actions have always been at the service of the peoples of the world. He knew that the United Nations can play a vital role in helping to free the peoples of the world from the poverty that dehumanizes them. He knew the United Nations could play that role to promote quality education for all, boys and girls, to fight against diseases such as HIV and AIDS, and to preserve our planet and its resources, as well as to curb the scourge of war and violence. He was convinced that lasting peace and sustainable peace could only be achieved through political dialogue and reconciliation. In this regard, respect for human rights is a commitment which must accompany us in every moment, and one which requires constant attention. The Peace-Building Commission, the United Nations Democracy Fund, and the Human Rights Council were all established during his second term of office, with the shared vision of enhancing global peace, security, human rights, democracy, and development. His conviction that it is our collective responsibility to protect the people of the world, and in particular the most vulnerable, has left a lasting imprint on us, one which commands our respect and admiration. When establishing his foundation at the end of his second term, he kept pursuing the goal of a lifetime by putting his dedication at the service of the weakest. His engagement within the elders, aiming at responding to humanitarian crisis, achieving reconciliation and promoting peaceful solutions to conflicts, was recognized by his peers, who chose him to chair this World Leaders Group in 2013. The strength and calm that always emanated from his being commended respect. For all of these reasons, our sadness is marked by the recognition we reserve for those who serve with humility, those who are never satisfied with their achievements, never rest on their laurels, and those who rise above their disappointments. Our gratitude goes to the man who was able to embody the responsibility of his post. Our gratitude goes to the wise man who, by his tolerance and subtlety, knew how to placate his interlocutors and gain their trust in greater service of the international community. We assure his family, his friends, the members of his foundation, and his country, Ghana, of our deepest sympathy.
Je remercie Madame.
I thank the representative of Monaco. And now I have the honour giving the floor to the distinguished representative of our host country, the United States of America.
Madam. Sir.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, guests, members of the Annan family. The United States joins fellow member states today to commemorate the life and work of former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. I express our deepest condolences on behalf of the United States to the Annan family and the people of his home country of Ghana. As a child of Africa and the first UN official to rise through the ranks to the position of Secretary General, Mr. Annan inspired generations to strive to leave the world a better place than they found it. We fondly recall that Mr. Annan, a true citizen of the world, spent part of his formative years in the United States as a student at Macalester College in Minnesota, where he encountered harsh winters, but also warm Midwestern hospitality. Upon graduating in 1961, Mr. Annan embarked on a career advocating for peace and human dignity with the United Nations. It's no exaggeration to say that Kofi Annan personified the United Nations for millions of people around the world. His lifelong service to the UN with the World Health Organization, the Office of the High Commissioner for Refugees, the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, and his 2 terms as Secretary General shaped the course of the organization and left a lasting impact across the fields of development, human rights, and peace and security. Leading the United Nations during a turbulent period, Mr. Annan helped the UN evolve to face new challenges, including through the establishment of the UN Peacebuilding Commission and the UN Democracy Fund, the creation of the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, and the adoption of the United Nations' first ever counterterrorism strategy. Even after leaving his post as Secretary General, he embodied the mission of the UN, continuing to advance peace and reconciliation through his leadership of the Kofi Annan Foundation and as chair of the Council of Elders. On a personal note, I had the great fortune to meet Kofi Annan in Stockholm many years ago at a conference on combating intolerance.
It was a brief encounter, but one that made a deep and unforgettable impression on me as a relatively junior diplomat. His warmth, his intellect, his profound decency and quiet, shining dignity, as well as his tireless commitment to work for a better world, exemplified for me what all diplomats should aspire to be. The themes that Kofi Annan championed, peace and reconciliation, improving the lives of the least fortunate, and recognizing the inherent dignity of every person, remain as urgent today as they were during his time with the United Nations. Today, we join the entire UN in celebrating his remarkable life and recalling his inspiring legacy. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United States of America e invito ahora.
And I now invite His Excellency Ban Ki-moon, 8th Secretary General of the United Nations, to make a statement.
Your Excellency, Madam Maria Fernanda Espinosa Garces, President of the General Assembly, Honorable Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, Madam Nan Annan, and family members, Excellencies, friends of Kofi Annan, and ladies and gentlemen. I'm honored to stand before you in this august body for the first time since I left this United Nations, to join you to pay a tribute to our dear friend and leader of this United Nations, Kofi Annan. As a lifelong civil servant, as a devoted family man, as the head of the United Nations during a turbulent decade, and as my friend, I have always had tremendous respect and admiration for Kofi Annan. And being back here in New York, I'm reminded that the entire world shares my admiration. Indeed, the international community was continually astounded by Kofi Annan's razor-sharp intellect, moved by his guiding compassion, and encouraged by his driving idealism. This was just as true for world leaders and diplomats in New York and Geneva as it was for everyday people in Kumasi, Ghana, and beyond. Those of us who had the honor to know him are extremely fortunate to possess warm personal memories of such an inspiring leader, one who gave so much to this world and was a genuine force for global good. I first met Kofi Annan when I served as chef de cabinet to the President of the General Assembly in 2001, and more closely when I served as Korean Foreign Minister. His support and kindness helped to pave the way for the path I took in following him. As his immediate successor as UN Secretary General, I relied on his guidance in ensuring a smooth leadership transition for the organization. And after I took up the reins as Secretary General, I again humbly called on him. He accepted the impossible task of mediating the deadlocked Syria talks. He helped to prevent the violence in Kenya, saving countless lives, and he served as my trusted advisor. After I concluded my tenure as a Secretary General, I was fortunate again to have the chance to work with him as a member of the Elders, where he served as chairman. In fact, I was proud under a year ago to work together with Kofi Annan, all of the elders, and young leaders from around the world, through central London to Nelson Mandela's statue. We worked together to honor those working to build peace in the face of conflict, division, and despair. a situation Kofi cared deeply for. He was a diplomat, but also a very inspirational leader, and he was always thinking of how he could inspire courageous leadership in others so that they could go on to overcome human suffering and to right the wrongs in the world. This is what he continued to do right up until the very end of his brilliant life. I always struggle to put into words just how much Kofi Annan helped me personally and how well he served humanity. His commitment to peace and conflict resolution, sustainable development, human rights, and global education resonated powerfully with all those he came across, including myself. But even though my tribute can never fully express the feelings in my heart, I'm confident that history will show as the years pass that Kofi Annan was a monumental leader. He was modest, yet simultaneously commanding. He was a leader who was deeply rooted in his past, yet possessed a colossal, illuminating vision for our collective future. He was a leader who has left us bereft with his passing, but has provided us with a remarkable legacy that will endure forever and continue to inspire. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who Kofi Annan succeeded as chair of the elders, said upon his death that he always saw him as a wiser younger brother. I saw him as a wonderful elder brother who taught me so much, which brings to mind one of his favorite sayings. I quote, "You are never too young to lead and never too old to learn," end of quote. To his wife Nant and his children Kozo, Ama, and Nina, my deepest condolences to you and your family. And to His Excellency President Nana Akufo-Addo and people of Ghana, who should be very proud of their son Kofi Annan. Ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, today in this August GA Hall, we stand together in deep mourning and in heartfelt tribute to a great man who embodied the universal ideals we all strive to uphold. Kofi, may you rest in peace for all of eternity. Thank you.
I thank former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and I now invite Madam Mary Robinson, representative of the elders, to pay homage. You have the floor, Madam.
Madam President, Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Nan and the Annan family, I'm honoured to speak here today in tribute to Kofi Annan, who was first my boss as Secretary General, and later we were elders brought together in July 2007 by Nelson Mandela. When I took up the appointment as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in September 1997, my staff in Geneva told me the exciting news that Kofi Annan had put through a UN reform package in July 1997, which provided for executive committees on peace, security, humanitarian and development issues, and that the Office of High Commissioner was the only one to be a member of all 4 executive committees. When I came to the General Assembly later that September and met my new boss again, I asked what he had in mind in having human rights at the table in all 4 executive committees. With a lovely smile, Kofi said, "That's for you to work out, Mary." During the 5 years I served in the post, I knew I had a Secretary General who was committed to linking peace, development and human rights. Yes, there were some tensions, The role of High Commissioner for Human Rights is to speak truth to power and to represent the first 3 words of the UN Charter, we the peoples. The role of the Secretary-General is a more complex diplomatic one, of essentially navigating the way forward through advocacy and persuasion. During this period, Kofi led the UN through some of the most difficult times in its history: Rwanda, Srebrenica, the Gulf War, and 9/11. It was a time when the organization's continued relevance was being openly challenged as the new millennium dawned. This must have been a huge professional burden, such a formidable task with tremendous personal pressure. And yet, Kofi steered the UN through this period with assured calmness, grace, and dignity. He left the organization with a sense of purpose, a vision, and a mission that it was struggling to define or defend when he arrived. Kofi's determination re-established the UN as a body to defend the poor and vulnerable, to provide support to those suffering injustice, and to be the custodian of equality and human rights. He lifted the UN into the 21st century and gave it a relevance and immediacy in a world facing new challenges of inequality, injustice, and of course, climate change. None of this would have been possible without his courage, without his powers of persuasion, without his optimism for the idea that when we work together, we can achieve great things. Kofi spent his whole life believing change is possible. He witnessed it in Ghana as a teenager when his home country gained independence, and he saw it time and time again in his 44-year career within the UN. He believed passionately in the United Nations and its role in defending and progressing human rights. He always referred to the UN as a family. He nurtured it like a family. He stood up for it like a proud father. He cared for its well-being and its future as a loving parent would. After his time at the United Nations, he established the Kofi Annan Foundation to continue his work, and we joined the Elders Together at its founding in 2007. Kofi saw our role as elders as an extension of his work on the issues closest to his heart: peace, justice, and human rights. He became our chair in succession to Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and he too had a great sense of humour. When I served as envoy of the Secretary-General for the Great Lakes and the Democratic Republic of Congo, I rang my husband Nick from Kinshasa on one occasion to our home on a lake in the west of Ireland. Nick explained that he was trying to sort out a local row, and he said, "Think of me as the special envoy of the small lakes." When I told Kofi this, he burst out laughing, and ever afterwards he would greet Nick as the special envoy of the small lakes. Kofi was working tirelessly right up to the end. I had the honour to join him on an elder's visit to Zimbabwe just before the country's recent elections on what would become his last public engagement. He wasn't feeling well, but he had a sense of the importance of a peaceful outcome for the people of Zimbabwe. He pushed himself hard and became ill on the flight back to Switzerland. His death shortly afterwards was a great shock to his beloved wife Nan and their family, to his foundation, to the elders, to the UN system, and to the many, many friends and people he influenced around the world. As we reflect here today on his legacy and the millions of lives he touched, I'm reminded of something Kofi would often affirm: that there is no peace without development, no development without peace, and neither peace nor development without human rights. He believed that this was what the UN existed to achieve, and through his quiet power of persuasion and stubborn optimism, it is what he has inspired many of us to dedicate our lives to. I, along with the entire world, will forever be indebted to him for that. Thank you.
Doy las gracias.
I thank Madame Robinson for her statement, and I now invite Ms. Taza Delinda, a former member of the Executive Office of the Secretary-General, to give a tribute.
Madam President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, distinguished delegates. I thank you enormously for giving me the honor to participate in this memorial service for the late Secretary General, Mr. Kofi Annan. Mrs. Annan, Ama, Kojo, Nina, family, and dear friends, let me begin by expressing my heartfelt condolences to you all. The loss of Mr. Annan will be felt by many all over the world. On this occasion, I would like to share with you the Kofi Annan I worked for and the person I came to know, respect, and admire throughout the years. I joined Mr. Annan's team in 1997 when he became Secretary General. I was one of his 2 personal assistants. The other one was Wagai Asebe, who worked with him for over 20 years and who would be here today instead of me had she not passed away. A few years after he left the United Nations, I joined Mr. Annan in Geneva, where he was the UN Arab League Joint Special Envoy for Syria. In between, we were regularly in touch. I'm both proud and humbled to have been asked to give a tribute on behalf of his staff. I would have never thought I would be standing here at this podium addressing you. Somehow, I have the feeling that Mr. Annan is looking down at me smiling, knowing that I'm out of my comfort zone, yet proud of me that I'm here. Mr. Annan knew the strengths and weaknesses of his staff. In a very subtle way, he encouraged all of us to push ourselves and take on responsibilities and tasks that we might have thought were beyond our capabilities, like today. I would like to share with you a few examples of Mr. Annan in action at the office. It was very rare to have a quiet day at the office. Mr. Annan generated work, even on a day off. Then again, he knew how to reduce stress at the office. Once, a head of state came to meet him entering the SG's office via the official door. When the meeting was over, they came out via the staff office's door. We were all surprised and stood up. After the departure of the head of state, Mr. Annan came back and said, "Did I surprise you by exiting via your door?" It was a nice way to end a hectic day, laughing. Here is another example. As is well known, Mr. Annan used to like walking. On trips, if Mr. Annan wasn't there, he would walk alone. For once, this was going to change. One evening, I received a message asking me to inform the staff that in the morning we would all accompany him on his walk. When I conveyed the message to the staff, I had to repeat it a couple of times. At first, they did not believe me. In the morning, as promised, Mr. Annan approached us and asked us if we were ready. We said that we were ready to go and took off. Little did we know that soon after, we would regret our compliance. Even though we were walking as fast as we could, he was always ahead of us. We never caught up with him, especially after he started running up the stairs 2 at a time. He never asked us again. Of all of Mr. Annan's positive traits, perhaps most important was his thoughtfulness. When he asked us, "How are you?" or "How is the family doing?" he always waited to hear the answer, even if he was pressed for time. He remembered details that were important to each one of us personally: a birthday, a son's graduation, a parent's sickness. He treated us all the same, irrespective of rank. Whenever a dignitary would meet with him and he felt that a member of his staff would have some sort of connection, country of origin, religious affiliation, or even a language connection, he would make sure to introduce the staff member to the dignitary. And when we looked for guidance, he was generous with his time and counsel. I can sum up my feelings about Mr. Annan by referring to a conversation I had with CBS anchorman Mike Wallace, who accompanied Mr. Annan on his mission to Iraq in 1998. In a quiet moment, Mr. Wallace asked me, "What is it that makes Mr. Annan so special, so that everyone appreciates his ways?" I enumerated a number of qualities and then realized what made Mr. Annan unique was that they were all embodied in one person. Mr. Annan was also a caring husband, father, and grandfather, always remembering the special days. Upon arrival to the office, he would say, "Today is Ama or Kojo's birthday. Let's call." Or, "Please send flowers to Mrs. Annan." And proudly he would add, "Today is our wedding anniversary." We, the UN staff, are very thankful for the opportunity to have known Mr. Annan. Just a privilege to be so close to such a great man. Dear SG, you'll be greatly missed. But even though you are gone, your legacy, your belief in a better future, and your vision will continue to live in each and every one of us. May you rest in peace. Thank you.
Doy las gracias.
I thank Madame Delenda for her statement, and I now invite Mr. Iqbal Risa, former Under Secretary General and Chef de Cabinet, to give a tribute.
Signora Presidenta,
Madam President,
and family, Mr. Secretary General. It is a great honor to be speaking here today at the memorial for former Secretary General Kofi Annan. Allow me to speak, please, at a very personal level and from a very personal perspective. Kofi Annan was literally my first friend in the UN in 1978. He had joined the UN 16 years earlier in Geneva and was a consummate UN insider. I had spent 20 years in the Pakistan Foreign Service in bilateral posts and joined the UN at a junior level, a total outsider. From our first chance meeting, we bonded. I sensed his special qualities: exceptional intelligence and acumen, and innate courteousness, a quiet self-assurance, and a slightly impish sense of humor. Later, other attributes emerged: a deep commitment to the goals of the UN, a strikingly wide circle of friends outside the UN, a dazzling memory, and natural charisma. We started meeting after work. He invited us home, where we first met Ama and Kojo as young children. Then a very special memory for me. While he was with UNHCR, I stayed with him in Geneva for a few days. He introduced me to a young lawyer in UNHCR of striking intellect and also beautiful and charming. A year or so later, Nan Lagergren and Kofi Annan married. And she is with us here today, as you know, with her lovely daughter Nina, although in this most sad of contexts. For 15 years, our tasks in the UN were on entirely separate tracks. Kofi rose rapidly in the Secretariat management structure. I was involved in political missions abroad, first to Iran and Iraq with Mr. Olof Palme and Mr. Jan Eliasson, then sent by Secretary General Perez de Cuellar to head missions in Nicaragua and El Salvador. While away, I knew I always could phone Kofi at headquarters for wise advice and support. Then our careers converged. In 1993, Secretary General Boutros Boutros-Ghali designated Kofi as head and myself as deputy head of the new DPKO. Now, working together, our friendship strengthened under the pressure of 16-hour days and only 12 hours on weekends. We were supported by a remarkably talented young UN staff and close, reliable teamwork. I recall vividly our first meetings in 1993 with the permanent representatives of the Permanent Five. Kofi, a young colleague, and myself on one side of a long table. On the other, the 5 powerful ambassadors, their aides behind them. Their questions, justifiably, were sharp, but some were also openly condescending. The fledgling USGC showed no sign of unease, retaining his composed demeanor. A week later, they were more collegial. In the 3rd week, he received not just cordiality, but open respect. In 1994, the uncertainty of a second term for Secretary General Boutros-Ghali was no secret, and Kofi began to be considered a possible successor. Then, unexpectedly, he was assigned during 1995 as Special Representative of the Secretary General in UNPROFOR in Zagreb, in the Balkans, where the Bosnia crisis, it's horrible to recall, was in its full form. He returned to DPKO after the Dayton Accord, and I succeeded him as SRSG during 1996 in the reduced UN mission with headquarters in Sarajevo. During those 2 years, we remained in phone contact not only on DPKO matters, but also on the politics for the next Secretary General. The pattern of voting and parallel vetoes in the late 1996 are on record. On Friday, December the 13th, at around 7 a.m., Kofi phoned me to say that the permanent representative concerned had called to inform him that the veto would be lifted. Of course, I congratulated him, and his response was that now I would be his chef de cabinet, and that was that. After the formal appointment by the General Assembly, some close friends gave advice to the new Secretary General. When one of them remarked that he would have to develop a thick skin in UN politics, he laughingly retorted that he knew that SG also stood for scapegoat. With just 2 weeks of transition, we moved quickly. The core DPKO team of Elizabeth Linden-Meyer, the late Wagaye Asebe, one of the gentlest persons I have ever known, Anastia Delenda, who just spoke to you, Shashi Tharoor, Fred Eckhart, and Lamine Cisse, all moved to the 38th floor, soon fortified by Edward Mortimer, enticed from the Financial Times, and Nader Mosavizadeh, later to co-author Kofi's memoir. From his first days as Secretary General, Kofi started to blossom in his grueling role, the most impossible job in the world. He moved swiftly and surely to bring far-reaching changes in the UN. A senior management group of all heads and funds and programs, including those away from New York, was established. No previous SG had such a coordination system, which mystified us, frankly. The first Deputy Secretary General, Louis Richet, also present in this hall today, was appointed and assigned substantive portfolios such as the reform program and oversight of the Oil for Food program. Human rights was assigned a special priority, and a special High Commissioner, Mary Robinson, was appointed. The campaigns for the MDGs and against HIV/AIDS was launched. The UN opened its doors to new constituencies, such as academia, foundations, and even a link with the private sector, and further innovative and imaginative measures. My modus operandi was to take as many decisions on the SG's behalf as I considered prudent, so that our most valuable asset, the Secretary General's time, could be devoted to complex and sensitive political issues. And I stayed at headquarters whenever he was overseas. The pressures were formidable, and the support from my talented special assistant, Fateme Ziai, proved indispensable. We all know that Kofi's first term was crowned by the Nobel Peace Prize for 2001, awarded jointly to the UN and received by Secretary General Ban Ki-moon.
All right, and there you've been watching all this time. The last, I guess, final words being shared by friends and family and former colleagues of the late Kofi Annan. He'd been honoured at the United Nations building this evening. All right, that's where we're going to wrap it.
Oh, yes, indeed. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you on Monday. The Full View team is up next.
A total of 8. Kofi's second term was to bring a sea of troubles which can only be briefly mentioned here. Beyond their global repercussions, they were to bring dire, lethal consequences for the United Nations. And of course, that includes Bosnia, Rwanda, Somalia, so on. The attacks on major cities of our host country on September 9, 2001, justifiably drew massive retaliation under the self-defense provisions of the UN Charter, validated ex post facto by the Security Council for the coalition that was formed. Afghanistan, already ravaged by the country's warlords and violent extremism, now also suffered huge bombardments with heavy civilian casualties. The Secretary General turns to Lakhdar Brahimi, the undisputed maestro of complex political negotiations. Later, he was asked to take on an equally daunting assignment to Iraq, a reflection of Kofi's high esteem for him. Iraq, too, suffered lethal consequences, which, first, its own regime brought on itself. We know that Saddam Hussein's faced accusations of covertly developing nuclear weapons. And intensive investigations by the UN were underway. Here, please permit me a personal vignette. When satellite photographs were being displayed in the Security Council as evidence of Iraq's secret efforts, I leaned over and whispered to the Secretary General, the General who was speaking. The General is not comfortable with what he is saying. He is following orders. After the massive attack by the coalition on Iraq, the Council decided to deploy a UN mission. Sergio Vieira de Mello was a colleague of extraordinary talents, and Kofi assigned him as SRSG. The three of us met in the SG's residence on a Sunday morning, and Sergio accepted the assignment with some reluctance. None of us can forget the calamity that struck the mission on the 19th of August, 2003, killing Sergio and 21 other courageous and dedicated UN colleagues. For Kofi and for all the United Nations, Sergio was a true hero, and he remains a hero to the entire UN family. Here, please permit me to recall that after the Security Council virtually decimated the UN force in Rwanda when the genocide erupted in 1994, General Romeo Dallaire refused to abandon its people in their blood-soaked nightmare, and he was another UN hero. Beyond containing wars and civil conflicts, the Secretary General, late in his second term, was confronted by a right-wing campaign in the host country on the oil for food imbroglio, bringing him into the political line of fire. Accusations and insinuations flew around, but eventually the Volcker inquiry absolved him, but left him wounded. Yet he prevailed to complete his second term. Such resilience is a rare quality. Please allow me to end with some vignettes. One of my first instructions to our close team when Kofi became Secretary General was that he would be addressed only as SG, no longer Kofi. Every few months I would ask him if his hat size had expanded, and he would assure me it was still the same. When a crisis became so aggravating that even Kofi's remarkable composure stood stress, I would remind him that in none he had a strong anchor in the storms that confronted him. In his second year as SG, I remarked to Nan that her husband had become a celebrity. She was scandalized and emphatically denied this. But the fact was that he, and a very reluctant Nan, inevitably became world celebrities and were recognized wherever they went. Once on a street in Italy, a passerby asked Kofi for an autograph, saying, "Please, Mr. Freeman," and Kofi, with a flourish, signed, "Morgan Freeman." What will be my memories of Kofi Annan? As our Secretary General, a builder of confidence and bridges between antagonists, a crusader to better the lives of the unfortunate and the deprived, above all, refugees, a dedicated defender of human rights everywhere, the epitome of soft power, well deserving of the sobriquet, the secular Pope. As a close friend, a man of innate and naturally deep kindness, generosity of spirit, and ever-ready empathy, characteristics that also define his wife, Nan. Only on the day of his passing did the reality strike me, and involuntarily a verse from school days, from Shakespeare, meandered back to my mind, albeit from a markedly different context. It is from the last lines of Julius Caesar, when Brutus, in deep remorse for joining in the assassination of Caesar, takes his own life. Please permit me to quote it as an epitaph for Kofi Annan. His life was gentle, and the elements so mixed in him that nature might stand up and say to all the world, "This was a man. This was a man."
Doy gracias al señor Raiza por su declaración. Invito a la señora Nane Annan, esposa del fallecido secretario general Kofi Annan, a tomar la palabra. Tiene usted la palabra.
You have the floor, madam.
Madam President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, dear friends and colleagues of our beloved Kofi, thank you for your deeply touching welcome of me and our family here at this very United Nations to which he devoted his life. We will cherish this moment, this Peace Day, and it will help us sustain us as we move forward. But are we not lucky? So many memories. No, not memories, but imprints. He had this glowing aura of radiant warmth and joy of life, which you literally could feel, and left this impact on people near and far. This was the impact of somebody who cared, not only for a person individually, but therefore by necessity cared for a fairer, more peaceful world for all of us to inhabit. I have received so many messages how he touched lives, inspired us to accompany him on the road to greater good. And I know the UN staff here and around the world is also with us this morning. And I want to thank you for the dedication and the commitment you always shown him, and also me. Thank you. But what a sad occasion that leads me to be standing here, exactly here where he stood, putting forth his far-reaching proposals. I remember the day he was elected Secretary General. I was sitting over there, and I saw him beautifully, gracefully come up here. And I remember the African ambassador who introduced him as the son of Africa, blown in on the winds of Sahara. The office of Secretary General is based on persuasive powers. And did he ever use his persuasive powers to the fullest? His whole being intent on finding solutions to challenges at hand, thinking outside the box, the rebel on the 38th floor. And there was no retirement from retirement. How could there be? There was still so much to do, so many challenges to take on. And as Mary said just now, the last mission he went to South Africa to honor Nelson Mandela's 100th birthday, and then on to Zimbabwe, concerned about the elections there. Although an elder, he had a very special connection to the young people. Did they feel that he was a kindred spirit who spoke to them from his heart, without pretense, and with genuine interest? And I also know that today a group of young, courageous leaders are here from the Extremely Together program at the Kofi Annan Foundation, which brings together young people from around the world to tackle violent extremism. Thank you. He died too soon, leaving us heartbroken and bereft, but he lived exactly as he wanted, to the fullest, packing in so many lifetimes in those 80 years of his. His legacy will live on in his foundation and in all of us. Thank you so much for today. Thank you.
I thank Madame Annan for her words, and I would like now to give the floor to Mr. Annan Kato, a special representative of the President of the Republic of Ghana. You have the floor, sir. I think there is a problem. No, I apologize. I would like to give the floor to Mr. Kojo Annan, son of Secretary General Kofi Annan. You have the floor, sir, and apologies for the mistake.
Madam President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, friends. It's an incredible honor for me to stand here in this awe-inspiring room in front of this august assembly to pay tribute to my father. This is hallowed ground. It's the only place on the planet where the entire world comes together to address mankind's biggest challenges and harness our greatest opportunities. And this is hallowed ground because, in a lot of ways, it is home. The UN was home to my father for the better part of 45 years and has always felt like home to me and my family. What is home anyway? I've been reflecting on that question a lot lately. What is home? Who am I? Where am I from? And where am I going? A father's death has a distinct effect of prompting uncomfortable existential questions. I was born in Geneva to a Ghanaian father and a Nigerian mother. I'm also a British citizen and have lived many years of my life in London, Lagos, Accra, and New York. My sister, Amma, is a US citizen who's lived in New York, Lagos, Paris, and London. My stepmother, Nan, Daddy's beloved wife of the past 35 years, is Swedish. My sister, Nina, is Swedish, and now recently Swiss. Nina's lovely kids are Swedish, Dutch, and Swiss. Don't ask me how the World Cup works in their house. My wife is quarter Nigerian, quarter Ghanaian, quarter Indian, and a quarter English. It's a mini UN. As a result, I've always thought of myself as a global citizen. But recently, as I reflected on my father's remarkable life, it struck me that being a global citizen has nothing to do with the stamps on your passport or the addresses you've lived at or your one world miles balance. It's a responsibility far greater than the trappings of privilege that my father's career afforded me. I finally understand that being a global citizen is about completely embracing the common humanity of all of the world's citizens. It's about seeing potential in anyone and helping build a world where anything is possible for that someone. It's literally unfathomable that an obscure young man born in Kumasi, Ghana's second city, 19 years before Ghana's independence, and who had never left the country before he was 18, would rise to one day become the seventh Secretary General of the United Nations. And yet, that was my father's story. It's a story that became his worldview. If it was possible for him, why should stability, peace, security, justice, sustenance, education, opportunity, or success be impossible for anyone else? I finally understand that being a global citizen is about creating a world where everyone can find home. The home is not where you're from or where you live. Home is being seen, being accepted for who you are, being encouraged, being comforted, being fed, being clothed, having a roof over your head, being loved, being supported, and being given access to opportunity. One of my father's favorite quotes came from Edmund Burke. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. It was more than a quote, it was his code. It's why he always felt at home here, surrounded by and working with you, the dedicated men and women of the UN and the member states who shared that code. To quote Secretary General Antonio Guterres, Kofi Annan was the United Nations, and the United Nations was Kofi Annan. Your Excellency, thank you for your wonderful words in Accra. We were deeply moved. My father's race has ended, but the work continues. He believed this was the only work worth doing, creating a world where everyone can find home. He fervently believed in this institution, and he believed in each of you. If my father were here, he'd implore you to keep fighting the good fight, to beat back the forces of inequality, disease, injustice, and strife. And he'd implore me to do the same. My father's passing has made it absolutely clear that I need to follow in his footsteps, not as SG or as a politician, but as a humanitarian, doing my little bit wherever I am and however I can for humanity. We all can do our little bit for a fairer, more peaceful world. We can all make peace personal in honor of Daddy. Thank you.
I would like to thank Mr. Kofi Annan for his words. I would like now to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Annan Kato, Special Representative of the President of the Republic of Ghana, to take the floor.
Madam President, Mr. Secretary General, Mrs. Annan and the Annan family, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I deem it a great honor to address the special commemorative session of the United Nations General Assembly in honor of the late Kofi Annan and to deliver this statement on the authority and on behalf of His Excellency Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo, President of the Republic of Ghana. May I from the outset express Ghana's sincere thanks to the President of the General Assembly and to the Secretary General for convening this special commemorative session. The government and people of Ghana deeply appreciate the expressions of sympathy and tributes which have been paid to the memory of our beloved compatriot, Kofi Annan, since his passing on the 18th of August, 2018. We are touched and comforted by the several heartwarming sentiments and statements made in the course of this morning's commemorative session. I wish to thank the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, and the staff of the United Nations, both serving and retired, who traveled to Ghana last week to attend the funeral service for Kofi Annan. Your presence in Ghana and that of a large number of current and former heads of state and government, royalty, representatives of international bodies, and eminent personalities from several countries was testimony to the high esteem and deep respect that the world held for Kofi Annan, a son of Ghana and of Africa, the 7th Secretary General of the United Nations, Nobel Peace Prize laureate, global citizen, and a statesman. Madam President, in his eulogy during the state funeral for Kofi Annan, the President of Ghana, His Excellency Nana Akufo-Addo, stated that, and I quote, "The epithets charming, cosmopolitan, consensus builder, elegant, eloquent, gentle-mannered, modest, polyglot, proud African, peacemaker, quintessential diplomat are still inadequate to capture the fullness of the personality of Kofi Annan, one of the truly iconic figures of modern times." As has been stated repeatedly, Kofi Annan always presented a frame of peace and equanimity behind a quiet human frame. His encounters with people around the globe attested to his commitment to what made for the dignity and solidarity of humanity. He devoted his life's work to making peace where there was conflict, to defending the human rights of the vulnerable and voiceless, and to promoting socio-economic advancement for all. As the first Secretary General from Sub-Saharan Africa, Kofi Annan brought considerable renown to Ghana and to Africa, evidenced by his conduct and comportment in the global arena, especially at difficult periods in the history of the organization. He represented a leadership that was infused with great diplomatic skill, commitment to the core values and principles of the United Nations Charter, and devotion to the welfare of humanity. As he himself articulated in the BBC interview earlier this year, for him, leadership was not so much about the individual as about the attributes required to serve the needs of society and people. Madam President, distinguished delegates and guests, let me conclude this brief statement by reiterating Ghana's appreciation to all member states for their sympathy and solidarity with the family, represented here by his widow Nan, his children, Ama, Kojo, and Nina, and with the government and people of Ghana at this period of mourning and loss. We are reminded that human existence is punctuated by significant events that provide opportunity for reflection and solidarity. This commemorative plenary of the General Assembly has been one such significant event. We have remembered and celebrated the life and achievement of Kofi Annan, a global citizen. It is Ghana's hope that the footprints which Kofi Annan has left behind will serve as a guiding light for future generations. No tribute or memorial to Kofi Annan will be more appropriate or more deserving than the reinforcement of our collective commitment to the urgent work of the United Nations in addressing the challenges of today's world. We the people was Kofi Annan's mantra. Let us rededicate ourselves to the Charter of the United Nations and to conflict prevention, conflict resolution, and effective peace building. Let us recommit to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and to the promotion and protection of the human rights and dignity of all persons. Let us work together to protect our planet and to advance sustainable development, leaving no one behind. Kofi Annan lived and worked for these ideals. May Kofi Annan's legacy and vision, which cannot be erased, inspire our individual and collective actions in these efforts. And may his soul rest in peace. Thank you.
I thank Ambassador Annan Kato, Special Representative of the President of Ghana. Les ruego ahora que permanezcan sentados mientras la familia del señor Annan abandona el salón de la Asamblea General. Pido ahora al oficial de protocolo que acompañe a la familia a la salida. Al término de esta sesión se celebrará una recepción con la señora Annan y su familia en el salón norte de los delegados, donde también habrá un libro de condolencias a disposición de los asistentes. Se levanta la sesión.
The meeting is adjourned. Thank you.